European culture knows many heroes, and Spartacus is among the most prominent of them. A Thracian by birth, Spartacus served as a soldier, tried himself as a gladiator, and ended up a leader of a major slave revolt. He became a symbol of freedom and an embodiment of the liberation struggle, be that class, social, or national liberation. Today, let's analyze who Spartacus really was, why his rebellion takes up such an important part of history, and why did it start with gladiators. Do you like our videos on history? Subscribe to our channel and share the link with your friends. As Spartacus was a gladiator, let us start by defining this term. In Latin, gladius stands for sword and gladiator a swordsman. Historically, this word refers to armed combatants who entertained audiences by risking their lives, title, and possessions in violent fights at arenas. How did this entertainment form appear? A theory has it that this tradition came from the Etruscans, the northern neighbors of the Roman Empire. However, there is no proof of that on Etruscan frescoes, vases, or ornamental art. The closest they had to gladiator fights was sacrificing prisoners at the funerals of their best warriors who were killed in wars. A more popular version claims that the Romans adopted this tradition from their southern neighbors in Campania. There lived the Samnites, quite bellicose tribes. At some point, they replaced the tradition of sacrificing people at mortuary ceremonies with fights between sentenced to death prisoners or slaves. Archaeological discoveries prove it too. The scientists found their ancient ruins that looked just like amphitheaters. One thing we know for sure is the Romans started the tradition of honoring the deceased in 264 BC, when Marcus and Decimus Brutus organized gladiator fights in the Forum Boarium in honor of their father. Along with the money for his own funeral, he left a will saying to purchase 6 slaves to fight in pairs at his wake. Eventually, this form of entertainment at somebody's wake became extremely popular. The audience loved it, and the combatants could show off their strength. So many benefits from someone's death. In the 1st century BC, gladiator fights turned into a tool of political struggle. Juvenal, one of the greatest Roman satirists, wrote later, "Two things only the people anxiously desire, bread and circuses." And naturally, people who threw gladiator fights earned higher status and more popularity. Sulla, a Roman general and statesman, was one of the first to use animal hunts in gladiator fights for political gain. In 93 BC, he placed 100 lions in Circus Maximus and made hunters catch them. Approximately 1,500 viewers enjoyed the cruel show. However, the true master of gladiator fights was Julius Caesar. Chased in the position of a magistrate, he threw fights to honor his father 20 years after his death. Smart move, right? He was the first to make 320 combatants wear silver armor and fight against each other. Most of these people were trained at Caesar's Gladiator School in Capua that could house up to 5,000 people. The first gladiator schools appeared in the south of Italy in Campania. Often they were kept by wealthy and influential people who needed a personal army of experienced soldiers to protect them. Those curious how one can take up such a risky career, welcome to Who Wants to Be a Gladiator? First, you find yourself in a gladiator school. How did you get there? You were either bought by a lanista, a man who purchased and looked after gladiators, or benched there for a crime. If you are the bold type, perhaps you came there for glory. Remember that you must be taller than 5.4 feet to get in a gladiator school. That is, taller than the average Roman. Next, you will receive proper training as a Roman legionary. You will also get a double-weight wooden sword to muscle up and feel more comfortable with an ordinary sword. Then you'll practice fighting on a dummy. Now, let's get more real and do mock gladiator fights in school. An experienced gladiator will kindly provide you with feedback to help you improve. So come on, fight! Perhaps you are afraid that the audience will give you a thumb down like in the movie Gladiator, and you'll be a goner. But in reality, that wasn't how it worked. Hollywood tricked us, as always. Modern researchers still argue about the gestures of approval or disapproval for gladiators. According to one version, the audience didn't show any gestures at all. Another version claims that showing a thumbs up meant death and showing a fist meant life and mercy for a fighter, as a fist resembles a sword in sheath. As you can see, bread and circuses gradually turned into an important political tool. This proves that at the time around the Spartacus Rebellion, the Roman Empire was going through hard times and tough crises, from 74 to 71 BC. By the end of the 2nd century BC, the problem of slavery in Rome reached its peak. The empire took part in so many wars of conquest that the number of slaves went off the scales. If you want to know all about the formation of the Roman Empire, its military secrets, and eventual collapse, take our course The History of Ancient Rome, from Emergence to Fall. The link is in the description box. The Spartacus uprising was the largest slave revolt against Rome, but not the first one. Sicily had already seen 2 slave rebellions by the time Spartacus came around. Slaves had to lead miserable lives, and the masters didn't bother to provide them with enough food or clothes. Estimation shows that slaves made up a third of the Roman population. Their position was lowly, and most slaves had to wear special collars with the master's name on it until this practice was abolished. Why? Seems that the slaves were not supposed to stand out from other people and show how numerous they were. Modern historians consider the Spartacus Rebellion to be a direct consequence of the Roman crisis. By the way, not only slaves joined the uprising, but the poor free people too. The Spartacus Rebellion that united 120,000 people stirred up all of Rome. Later it was called the Third Servile War. It all started in Capua with 200 gladiator slaves fed up with such a life. According to the Greek essayist Plutarch, most of them were not gladiators by choice, but because of their master's cruelty. Spartacus was the one to lead the uprising. What do we know about him? Well, just a few things. This man came from Thrace, a country in southeast Europe. He served in the Roman army but didn't want to obey the order to conquer his motherland. He fled the army then and was imprisoned for desertion. Already a slave, Spartacus was sold to a gladiator school. And it was he among all people there who managed to break free and lead other gladiators after him. Plutarch noted that Spartacus was incredibly courageous and physically strong, and his intelligence and personality traits made him resemble a noble Greek. Coming from Plutarch, the comparison of a slave with a free Greek was the greatest compliment of the time. One more thing. Even though Spartacus was a slave and a gladiator, he became a kind of celebrity of his time. He was privileged, had a wife and owned a room, several rooms most likely, to live in. Yet freedom is better than slavery, isn't it? The uprising quickly grew massive. Historians are not sure whether the slaves had a plan or everything happened on the spot, but at an early stage, about 10,000 people supported the Spartacus Rebellion. His allies and he managed to turn the rebels into an unstoppable military force, and intensive training allowed the warriors to quickly fight off the enemy's actions. They were trained by the initial leaders of the uprising, the Gladiators. Yet the Roman authorities didn't consider them worthy enemies, just a bunch of slaves who got out of hand. No one wanted to pay them much might and resources. Besides, that time was turbulent for Rome. The empire waged war with Mithridates VI, the ruler of the Hellenistic kingdom of Pontus, fought against Spain, and so on. Spartacus decided to lead his army through the Alps to cross the mountains and lead everyone home to Thrace or Gaul. But something went wrong, and at the foot of the Alps, the rebel army turned back. Why did they do that? The reason is still unknown. Either weather and rough paths stopped them, or the poisonous desire to take revenge on Rome led them away from safety and freedom. So the rebels moved south to Sicily. By that time, Rome had already recognized the scale and the power of the rebellion. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man of the empire, gathered an army and took the lead in fighting Spartacus and his people. The methods of Crassus were simple yet effective. He decided to block the rebel army, starve, and exhaust them. Crassus locked them up in the southern part of the peninsula, the Strait of Messina, that was just 3 kilometers wide at the narrowest point. From there, Spartacus and his people probably intended to go on to Sicily. They had just suppressed several minor uprisings. Spartacus hoped to light the fire of rebellion there once more, but his plan was doomed to fail. The ships that were supposed to take the army to Sicily never arrived, and even when Spartacus' army was trapped, Crassus couldn't outdo them. The Senate sent him support then. Pompey the Great from Spain and Lucullus from Macedonia arrived with their armies. Concerned by the forces united against him, Spartacus boldly attacked Crassus. That was his last battle. Without the leader, the slave army quickly grew weaker and lost discipline. It didn't die in a minute, but turned into an easy target for Roman commanders and their legions and eventually suffered complete defeat. Spartacus and his people lost their final battle but left a mark on the history of Rome. Several enslaved brave men inspired a full-on war against the power players of the empire. Interestingly, the Spartacus Rebellion became a landmark event only in the 18th century when people needed a symbol of liberation. At that time, most wars happened in the name of freedom and equality. Who would embody these ideas the best? Since the 18th century appreciated ancient history and art, its greatest minds turned to the story of Spartacus the Thracian, who died fighting for freedom. The image of Spartacus inspired other rebellions. One of them took place in one of the French colonies. The Haitian Revolution, for instance, became the most successful slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere. Contemporaries called Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the uprising, Black Spartacus, and one of the fathers of United Italy, Giuseppe Garibaldi, was also compared to the gladiator. What is more, he became the symbol of abolitionists that fought against slavery in the South. John Brown was compared to Spartacus too. In 1859, he tried to start a riot for slavery abolishment, but lost and was executed. But let's go back to Rome. Over 6,000 people were crucified along the road from Capua to Rome. The uprising resulted in increased tension between Crassus and Pompey, which ended with, surprisingly, the victory of Caesar. What does Caesar have to do with it, you ask? By the time Spartacus was stopped, Caesar was 30 years old already and was ready to kick off his political career. And what about slavery? Well, the Spartacus uprising didn't bring any radical changes to the oppressive system of Roman slavery. Only in the next centuries, the number of war prisoners of the empire decreased, and the inhabitants of the conquered areas gained the status of ordinary Roman citizens. The number of slaves began to decline then, and people saw that hiring colonists, peasants legally tied to the land, was more beneficial for them than keeping slaves. If things were running so smoothly, how did the mighty Roman Empire fall? Learn the answer in the Module 6 of our course, The History of Ancient Rome. The link to the course is in the description box. Subscribe to our channel and share it with your friends if you enjoyed our breakdown, and thank you for watching.